When I was a child, my room was my world. It was a small space, but it felt enormous to me back then. The walls were painted a light blue, covered with posters of my favorite cartoons, and the shelves were crammed with books, action figures, and stuffed animals. Each item had its place, and everything felt familiar, safe. Among my collection was a small stuffed frog, sitting upright on a little green sofa tucked in the corner of my room. The frog wasn't special by any means. It had soft, worn fabric and bright, embroidered eyes that seemed to stare at nothing in particular. It was one of those toys you'd win at a carnival and then forget about until it reappears while cleaning. But somehow, that frog was different, not in an obvious way. Nothing about it screamed creepy or out of place. But in hindsight, I think it always unsettled me. I just didn't realize it back then. I must have been about 10 years old at the time. My parents' room was right next to mine, so I always felt secure knowing they were just a shout away. On that particular night, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I brushed my teeth, changed into my favorite pajamas, and climbed into bed, burying myself under the covers. As I lay there, the glow of my small nightlight illuminated the familiar shapes of my room, casting soft shadows on the walls. My eyes wandered to the corner where the little sofa and the stuffed frog sat. It wasn't uncommon for my toys to catch my attention before I fell asleep. They were comforting, like silent companions. But that night, as I stared at the frog, I felt something I couldn't explain. A faint uneasiness, like the kind you get when someone is standing too close to you. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I was known for having an overactive mind, always inventing stories or picturing strange scenarios. I closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep, thinking tomorrow would be just another ordinary day. If I'd known what was about to happen, I might not have let sleep take me so easily. It started like any other dream, a fragmented swirl of familiar images and nonsensical ideas. I found myself sitting on the small green sofa in the corner of my room, the one where the stuffed frog always rested. But this time, I wasn't alone. To my left, the frog sat upright as always, though its posture seemed slightly more rigid, its embroidered eyes glinting as if they had depth. To my right sat a girl about my age, with long, dark hair that fell messily over her shoulders. She wore a pale blue dress, almost the same shade as my walls, and her bare feet swung gently above the carpet. She was a stranger, but in the way dreams sometimes work, I wasn't alarmed. Instead, it felt as if we had always known each other, like she belonged there in my room. The three of us, me, the girl, and the frog, sat silently for what felt like forever, though there was no tension, just an odd sense of expectation hanging in the air. Then, as dreams often do, it shifted. Suddenly, the girl spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a strange weight that sent a shiver down my spine. "You need to be careful with him," she said, nodding toward the frog. I looked at it, confused. The toy seemed the same as it always had, motionless and harmless. But when I turned back to the girl, her expression had changed. Her eyes, dark and wide, were fixed on mine with an intensity that made me feel small, like she was seeing through me. "Don't let him out of your sight," she continued, her voice now sharper, more urgent. "If you do, he'll move." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to ask what she meant, but before I could speak, the frog turned its head. It wasn't a quick movement, but slow and deliberate, as if it wanted me to see every second of it. Its lifeless embroidered eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt an overwhelming wave of dread, the kind of fear that paralyzes you, making your chest tight and your breathing shallow. "Do you see now?" the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. I tried to stand, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The frog's face was so close now, closer than it should have been, and its unblinking eyes bore into me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in bed anymore. I was still on the little green sofa, exactly where I'd been in the dream. My heart was racing, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was awake or still dreaming. But the girl was gone, and the frog sat in its usual place, motionless once again. Before I could process what was happening, a loud crash broke the silence. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, the kind of noise that would wake the whole house. And then came the footsteps. I shot up from the sofa, my heart pounding like a drum. The footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my door, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. I froze, staring at the door, the weak light from the hallway seeping through the crack at the bottom. "Mom, Dad," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, hoping desperately to hear their familiar voices. But there was no answer. Gathering my courage, I stepped toward the door. My legs felt shaky, like they were moving through water. The stuffed frog sat on the sofa behind me, its lifeless gaze boring into my back as if it was watching me leave. The hallway was dim, only partially lit by the soft glow of the nightlight plugged into the wall. It cast long, unnatural shadows that stretched toward me, clawing at my imagination. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating, and there was a faint, musty smell that hadn't been there before. "Hello," I whispered again, stepping cautiously into the hallway. As I moved further, I noticed something strange. My parents' bedroom door was open, a door they always kept closed at night. Peering inside, I saw the room was empty, the bed still neatly made. The sound of something soft brushing against the carpet sent chills down my spine. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway and the faint hum of the house settling. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped. The living room below was cloaked in darkness, and the silence was so thick that it made my ears ring. But then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something, a faint movement. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first, it looked like a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. Something was there, a figure. It stood at the bottom of the stairs, barely illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the living room window. It was small, almost childlike in stature, but its proportions were all wrong. Its head too large, its limbs too thin, and it was holding something. The stuffed frog. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to move. The figure didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. Suddenly, it tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a wave of dread crashing over me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How had the frog gotten there? Who or what was holding it? The figure took a step toward the stairs, its movements unnaturally fluid, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. And then it whispered. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was enough to send me running. I bolted back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stay put. But as the seconds ticked by, I realized something chilling. The frog was no longer on the sofa. I stayed pressed against the door, my breath shallow and rapid. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the lock, twisting it again to make sure it was secure. The silence outside was deafening, amplifying every creak and groan of the old house. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what I had just seen, or thought I had seen. Was it a dream, a trick of the shadows? But the image of that figure at the bottom of the stairs, holding the stuffed frog, was seared into my memory. I turned to face the room, scanning every corner. The frog was gone, but everything else was exactly as it had been before I left. My bed was unmade. The small sofa sat in the corner, and the moonlight poured through the window, casting faint patterns on the carpet. Then, a sound broke the stillness. A soft, muffled thump. It came from the closet. Every hair on my body stood on end. My gaze snapped to the closet door, which was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of darkness to spill out into the room. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there. But the sound came again, this time louder. It wasn't my imagination. Something was inside. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. No response. I took a hesitant step forward, my bare feet sinking into the carpet. The air felt colder now, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and makes your skin prickle. As I reached the closet, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something deeper, morbid curiosity or sheer terror, kept me rooted in place. Summoning every ounce of courage, I yanked the door open. The closet was empty, or so I thought. At first glance, it was just my clothes hanging neatly on the rack, a few boxes stacked at the bottom. But then I noticed something out of place, a shadow that didn't belong. It was tucked into the farthest corner, just out of reach of the dim light spilling in from the room. And then it moved, a soft shuffling sound, followed by the faintest glimmer of green. My stomach dropped. It was the frog. It sat propped up against the wall, its black button eyes staring directly at me. But there was something different about it. Its once innocent expression seemed twisted. Its sewn-on smile appeared wider, almost as if it had been stretched. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I noticed something else, a faint whisper, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was coming from the frog. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down my spine. "Come closer." I bolted. I didn't stop to think or look back. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and threw open the bedroom door, sprinting down the hallway and barreling down the stairs. The house seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more menacing. When I reached the front door, I yanked it open and ran out into the night, the cool air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't stop until I reached the curb, where I collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. From the safety of the street, I turned to look back at the house. My bedroom window was dark, but I could swear I saw something move, a faint flicker of green against the glass. I sat there until dawn, too scared to go back inside. As the first rays of sunlight touched the street, I finally mustered the courage to return to the house. My parents' car was in the driveway. The sight of it brought a wave of relief, though it did little to steady my trembling hands as I opened the front door. The house felt different. The oppressive darkness from the night before was gone, replaced by the ordinary warmth of morning light streaming through the windows. But despite the familiarity, a sense of unease still lingered, like the faint echo of a nightmare. "Mom, Dad," I called out, my voice shaking. "In here," my mom replied from the kitchen. I followed her voice, feeling the tension in my chest ease slightly at the sound of normalcy. My parents were seated at the table, sipping coffee and scrolling through their phones as if nothing had happened. Did you hear anything last night?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They both looked up, puzzled. "No, we didn't hear a thing." "Why?" my dad asked, setting his mug down. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain. How could I make them understand what I had experienced without sounding crazy? "Nothing," I muttered, shaking my head. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The events of the night before replayed in my mind like a broken record. The figure on the stairs, the frog in the closet, the whispers. It all felt so vivid, so real. I couldn't just brush it off. That's when I decided to go back to my room. I needed to know if it was still there. The climb up the stairs felt agonizingly slow, each step creaking beneath my weight. When I reached the top, I paused outside my bedroom door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The room was just as I had left it. Messy bed, clothes strewn about, sunlight streaming through the window. But the closet door was still open. My heart sank as I stepped inside and cautiously approached the closet. The frog was gone. I dropped to my knees and began rummaging through the piles of clothes and boxes, desperate to find some trace of it. But it wasn't there. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. That's when I noticed something else. Carved into the wall of the closet, just above where the frog had been sitting, were words. 4 jagged, uneven letters scratched into the paint, as if by tiny claws. Play. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of the carving, desperate to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. But as I stared at the photo, a cold realization washed over me. The word was there, clear as day, but beneath it, faintly etched into the wall, as if by an unseen hand, was another word. Again, the air seemed to grow heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. I could feel it, an unseen presence watching me, waiting. I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back in the kitchen, clutching my phone like a lifeline. "What's wrong?" my mom asked, concern etched on her face. I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just shook my head, muttering, "Nothing. I need some air." Over the next few days, I tried to move on, convincing myself it was all in my head. But the whispers didn't stop. At night, when the house was quiet, I would hear it, a faint, raspy voice calling from the shadows. "Play again." And each time, the sound grew closer.